With development pressures, climate change and declining space for connectivity across the Greater Sydney Basin and beyond, there is an increasing need for restorationists, plant producers, planners and landscape architects to collaborate on ensuring natives of the correct provenance and genetics are conserved as well as planted within urban spaces.
I'd like now to introduce John Blair. John is lecturer, tutor and researcher at the Faculty of Built Environment, University of New South Wales. He's worked there since returning from Indonesia in 2011, where he worked on climate change mitigation. And recently he's been investigating diesel emissions on construction sites, so a diverse area of study and interest, as well as carbon sequestration and storage potential of the Sydney rail network. But also, he's been working on the conservation of Eastern Suburbs Banksia Scrub and has a novel idea. So thank you very much, John.
Thanks, everyone. I'm delivering this sort of on behalf of my boss, Paul Osmond, who one or two of you may know. He's the horticulturalist / botanist. I'm much more bricks and mortarish by the sound of things. But the ESB has come up a couple of times during question periods, so it is a very current and topical issue. What can we do about it? A beautiful image of heath plants. We're not quite sure what the image is of, whether it's Banksia ericofolia or whether it's Banksia marginata. We're not quite sure, but it's, and native fuchsia, of course, but it is terrific. And there's another one of the heathland. We'd certainly be focusing on this kind of height of plant for a green roof, an extensive green roof, which only has minimal substrate. And we have to be careful about the bearing capacity of the roof that we're putting it on as well, of course. Status. Well, here's a background for you. Elimination, extermination, extinction on a large scale. And equally dramatic is the ESB coverage, which has declined from something like 5,300 hectares when we first came here in 1788 to about 146 hectares. And there's more in that latter figure to come. It's now critically endangered by the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act. Why has it disappeared? Very obvious reasons. Land clearing for urban development, huge amount, of course, before its critically endangered status, which in theory will prevent further clearance, but in practice may not. And then there's incidental grazing by all sorts of animals, including rabbits and people who ride around on bicycles because they're unaware of the caliber and the importance of that residual piece of land. And also some natural reasons. We can't really allow fire on those sites to permit regeneration to take place. Although there are six sites under active management by various entities, including probably the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Where's the gentleman with the flowery shirt? I'm not sure whether that's still the case, but I understand it is. What's left? I can't point to this, but obviously those black lines are local government boundaries. The large grey areas are the original distribution of the ESBS, and those very tiny, almost invisible little grey, darker grey spots are the residual sites. Now it totals 146 hectares, and that's still apparently the case with a much more recent source than that from DPIE, right? But it's scattered over a wide variety, a wide number of sites, which in itself puts further stress on the individuals. So it's not 146 hectares, it's actually probably lots of 10-hectare sites or 5-hectare sites. And gaining protection from those is very difficult in a dense urban area. Actually, we're not half as dense as some other cities in the world, but it's still extremely difficult to gain that level of protection that you need to guarantee its existence. Okay, I've already mentioned that. Extremely high risk of extinction. The TSSC is the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, and that statement was made just a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago. So, if we're worried about the survival of these tiny sites at ground level, what do? We look upwards, we jump upwards, hopefully only 1 story, but if necessary, more than that. Green roofs can potentially support the conservation of the ESBS. And why do we think that? With these suitable species, I'm not dwelling on this large number of species that are available for transmission to a green roof. There is a lot of international literature on green roofs. Much has been on fauna, but there's also material on conserving endangered flora overseas. There's, as far as I know, someone corrected me at lunchtime, as far as I know, there's no literature which suggests that Australia has done any conservation on green roofs of endangered flora. So this might be a first that we're proposing at UNSW. There's some critical factors that we need to take into account, as you can see there: substrate depth, the age of the green roof, giving plants enough time to evolve and mature, and height above grade will also have some bearing on the quality of the conservation. Ideally, we would like to take some of the natural substrate on some of these many vulnerable sites around the eastern suburbs and transfer to some of the cells on the green roof. It is possible that we will not be permitted to do that. So we will need to have discussions with Paul Adams from BEES. BEES is on UNSW campus. It stands for Biological, Environmental and Earth Sciences, I think, something like that. And so alternatives to inoculants from ESBS sites. We will need to discard if we're able to take this material from a site, we'll need to take off the leaf litter because it will be too rich, probably, for the ESBS. And we'll need to transfer soil organisms. But none of this is necessarily going to be permissible. So we may have to rethink our tactics at some point after discussions with the people who've been very much involved with the ESBS at ground level. This is our research design. The A represents aeolian sand, and then there's the B represents artificial sand, and the C represents a commercial substrate. And then on top of that, we have various other variables that we look at: the ESBS itself, sedum species, and perhaps 1 or 2 cells unplanted to see what actually happens over a 2 or 3 year cycle on the unplanted cells, and a variety of substrate depths. So what's happening now? We did have a roof established, International House at UNSW campus. We were then told it was going to be demolished to make way for a new building. So we then scattered around for other roofs, and that's in process. We may well have another roof identified. It's not at 1st floor level. Unfortunately, it's at 4th floor level. There's always a potential risk at that sort of level with very high gale wind type events of losing something. But nevertheless, beggars can't be choosers. We did have a grant application for this research into environmental trust, but it didn't work. It failed, and I called to see why it had failed. And the person who talked to me said, well, why don't you just do this with Randwick Community Nursery? They'll provide all the seeds that everyone needs from around the Sydney region without any difficulty. You don't have to go bother about putting it all on a green roof. We thought that was a pretty cavalier kind of response. So conservation requires deliberate action. If we can make this succeed at above ground level, there is considerable support for the efforts that are taking place by government agencies, Friends of Malabar Headland, and so forth, to secure at least a large proportion of the ESBS plant species. Thank you.